آزادی بیان
言论自由
Free speech.
The free speech debate is joined today by Dr. Giles Fraser for a discussion on religion and free speech. If I could begin by asking you, do you consider free speech to be an inherently Christian value?
God, that's such a difficult question to start with. Of course, I want to say yes, but I mean, the Christian Church doesn't have a particularly stunning track record when it comes to celebrating freedom of any or as it happens, or free speech specifically. I mean, no, I don't think that's high up on its great on its values. I mean, I think that I think freedom of speech is a 20th century value, and in fact, my own view is that it's come to be a sort of cuckoo value that's pushed out all other values, and now it seems to be the only value that we're allowed to have. And I think Christianity celebrates other values, and I think they're rather important to reclaim. But the one that it hasn't been, and I'm a product of the 21st century myself, so I obviously think free speech is an important part of a basket of values. But I'm always going to want to qualify it, and qualify it in terms of the sorts of things that Christianity has celebrated.
Jesus Christ was someone who was accused of blasphemy within his own ministry. What do you think he would have made of the 21st century concept of free speech?
I think there's a problem with the way in which free speech can also be used as an alibi for the denigration of vulnerable and minority groups. And that's my main beef with free speech, unqualified celebration of free speech. And for example, the Charlie Hebdo thing, on the one hand, I mean, my instincts are quite mixed on it, because on the one hand, I obviously want to celebrate the ability of the newspaper, well, not celebrate, but support the ability of that newspaper to say all sorts of things that it likes. But I think it's a nasty little magazine. And I think there were also things about it which were anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim. And I think what happens is a narrative, particularly there, a narrative of free speech that's developed as the voice of a vulnerable minority against a sort of totalitarian church is something I want to say yes to. And so, you know, I think the sort of the main target at the back of that French secularism is always going to be the Roman Catholic Church and the hegemony that it had. But now, of course, you know, that's long gone. And now the sorts of people they're using the same right to free speech against are actually rather vulnerable people, poor people on the outskirts of the periphery in bad estates, and who don't have that access to the media. And actually, I think there's a form of bullying that's attached to it. So that's the point where I go, no, I'm going to pull back. So your original question is, you know, what would Jesus think of this? Well, I think in part Jesus was talked about the support for, the solidarity with those who are the least in society. And I'm not sure that's actually what Charlie Hebdo is doing at all. So, you know, I think there's conflicts about all of this. And just simply to say free speech is what we want is something that I feel uncomfortable with as a way, as you know, what that can bring through.
So when it comes to the discussion in society today about the form and the limits that apply to free speech, do you think the church has a role to play in that discussion?
Exactly right. That's exactly what I think. I mean, you know, the sort of one of the great creedal statements for me is you bring down the mighty from their thrones, you lift up the lowly. And that, for me, is part of what happens with Christianity. And helping to give those people who are poor and vulnerable and don't have the platform access that the modern media requires, I think that's a really important part of my particular ministry. That's what I would see that.
So then, would you say that there should be a sort of form of relativism perhaps applied to free speech, that it is not the same for everyone, it is not a one size fits all?
Well, I think it's not one size fits all. No, I don't have a relativism about it. I don't like that. I have a sort of agonistic way in which these relate to each other, which is I think they fight each other, and I find it very difficult to come up with a general law which determines when should win. But it seems to me quite clear that there are certain voices which are silenced in society and certain voices which are celebrated, and the ones that are celebrated and the ones that have access, the ones that enjoy free speech are generally white, middle class, wealthy, Western voices, male voices. So, that's the problem with free speech, is actually it doesn't do what it says on the tin. It doesn't give free access for women, for people who are who are some sort of minority group. But I mean, I think particular in the current age for people, for Muslims. I think that's, so very recently, in the last few days, a London mayor has been had up on corruption charges, and as a part of the legal case against him was that 100 imams had written a letter to a Bangladeshi newspaper to say that they supported his candidature, and this was seen as, by the judge, undue spiritual influence. Today, 5,000 business leaders are able to write to the Daily Telegraph to say, we don't want you to vote Tory, we want you to vote Tory, we don't want you to vote Labour, that's going to be absolutely disastrous. They're on the front page of the newspaper for saying that. But the 100 imams who write to say that they supported a particular candidate, that's illegal. Now, that for me is a, that shows something about access.
So, in light of what you've just said, would you think that the church then has an important role to play in that discussion?
Well, it should have, not that it is doing that. I think part of the job of the church is to give voice to those who don't have one. I think that's quite hard for an established church to do, actually. I'm not in favour of the establishment of the Church of England. So I think, as an established church, we have a huge platform privilege. And there are those who argue that we need to maintain that platform privilege because we give voice to the voiceless. I think that's a slippery argument myself. I think we're much better placed to do that if we weren't established.
You've written before that faith is about being a part of something wider than oneself. So do you think when it does come to finding this form of free speech, what should be at the heart of it is a sort of collective understanding or sort of a social understanding rather than the individual right to say whatever one wants?
I'm a communitarian at heart rather than a liberal. I think the celebration of individual rights has just pushed out all other ways of conceiving of morality, and I think that's a consequence of capitalism. I think it's a form of individualism which collapses a morality into the sort of choices you might make in the supermarket. So it's whether you want one form of cornflakes or another form of cornflakes, and that's the sort of paradigm instance of choice that we now develop, whether it's NHS or something, we're all consumers, and that's what we mean by choice and the individual and so forth. And I'm anxious that the whole free speech thing becomes a part of that, and that it just becomes another emanation of sort of capitalist ethos, which doesn't actually do what it says it does. It doesn't allow equal access to people finding their voice or having a voice. As I say, I think it's a white Western male perspective. So
would you say then that freedom of speech is an inherently positive concept?
Yeah, it's a positive concept, but it's a qualified positive concept. And it seems to me that's absolutely how it should be. I do not believe in using that as a moral concept to defend the denigration of minority groups, which is what I think Charlie Hebdo was all about. So would I want to make that newspaper illegal? No. Would I want to condemn it morally? Yes. That seems to be entirely right. So, you know, on a legal level, I mean, I'm quite committed to free speech as a concept, but on a moral level, I think it needs much greater challenging and much greater awareness of its complicity in some other forces of oppression.
Have you ever personally faced censure as a representative of the church? Have you ever found that you have not been able to exercise your own right to free speech? Thing that you wanted to say?
No, I'm quite surprised by that, actually. I remember when I first started writing for newspapers, I don't think I've told anybody about this, when I first started writing for newspapers, which was 12 or so years ago, I wrote something early on about, I think it was a rather rude piece about the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I sort of thought to myself, oh dear, what do I... And so I phoned up Lambeth Palace and I said, look, I've got to tell you, I'm writing this piece and this is the piece I'm going to write, and just so you know I'm going to write it. And they were very chilled about me writing it. I put the phone there and I thought, why did I ask? And, you know, what was that about? And I was really young. I mean, I wouldn't do that in a million years now. But what's really interesting is that just remembering that just reminds me of the fact that actually never has anybody come down from on high and said, you can't write that. I mean, that said, of course, that's not how the church operates. How the church operates is, after a while, you're not one of us. That's what, you know. So it's whispered conversations in the Athenaeum where they suddenly decide that you're, you know, not really part of the club and so forth, and you get perhaps sort of pushed to one side, but that, or that may be just me bleating on. But no, absolutely nobody, to the church's credit, has ever said, you shouldn't have said that.
And do you think, I mean, we talked about earlier this idea of sort of a moral consumerism with black and white choices between sort of questions of morality. Do you think that attitude has seeped into the Church of England when it comes to free speech?
You see, I think the church is probably more circumspect about the language of free speech, precisely because it has to hold out a slightly broader, a broader value system than one that's simply about liberal individualism. You know, I mean, that's what it is. And so from whatever perspective, from the left, which would be my perspective, or from the right, I think there would be a much more nuanced sense about free speech. And of course, because of that, people will say, look, you know, this is the old church oppression, you know, we want to tell people to shut up and so forth like that. Well, no, I'm not wanting to do that, but I think people need to have a sense of, I mean, watch their privilege. I mean, in a sense, that's something, and we say watch your privilege about all sorts of things, but actually people are not always terribly good at watching their privilege when it comes to the speech they have. I mean, I think that's my critique of Charlie Hebdo, really. I don't think they were sufficiently sort of self-critical about their own privilege. And I think the church can do that. But there again, you know, I mean, people would be right to challenge me and say the church is in a highly privileged position, and that's true.
Would you say that the Charlie Hebdo attacks have fundamentally changed the relationship between religion and free speech?
No, because I think I think there was a qualified view all along. I think it's changed. I mean, one of the really interesting conversations that I had, I mean, I chaired a debate at The Guardian just a few days after the debate, and there was quite a few cartoonists there. And my friend Martin Rowson, who's one of the cartoonists for The Guardian, he was saying, look, I'm in this business. I'm not in this business to have a go at the vulnerable. I'm in this business to have a go at bullies, powerful bullies. That's what my cartoons are always intended for. And I would not be comfortable using that same power to have a go at people who are really vulnerable. And that, I think, was the difference between Martin Rosen, for instance, and Charlie Hebdo. So I think there's a, fun enough, I think that, you know, the sort of satirical side of, I mean, some satirists, I think, were challenged by what happened there, at the same time as wanting to insist legally upon the right of magazines like Charlie Hebdo to exist.
If I can remain with France then, would you say then that modern secular France's ban on religious symbols within the workplace and within schools is in itself a restriction on the freedom of expression?
Too bloody right, I would. Yes. Absolutely. I mean, that's the astonishing thing. I mean, you know, you have French secularism has become the hegemonic thing that the Catholic Church used to be. And that's the thing about which you can't complain or speak about, or it's so much more difficult to. Yes, I mean, there are various forms of religiosity which are unmentionable in France. You can't even collect official data that has, you know, your religious preferences attached to it. It's as almost as that has become invisible to the French state. Now they think that's a part of their neutrality. I think that's a part of their hegemony.
Dr. Giles Fraser, thank you very much for participating in this discussion of the free speech debate.
آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech